All right, welcome to our CS364 presentation for the facade design pattern by Jefferson Santos and Landon Shumway. And we're going to be discussing some of the uses and benefits of the facade design pattern and how we can use it for our semester project of the student calendar. So let's jump right into it. So let's define what the facade design pattern actually does. So a way of looking at it, it's kind of like a simplified interface class, and its purpose is to make it easier for a client to use the features of a complex interface, such as like a vast library of functions, or multiple interfaces that maybe share a commonality in their what they do, such as like a group of APIs, and we'll be looking at an example of that in a little bit. The facade design pattern. So according to the design patterns book by the Gang of Four, where this comes from, it's defined as a unified interface to a set of interfaces in a subsystem. So it's really useful in tying in a bunch of interfaces for a specific aspect of your program to make it easier to implement those functions. So let's look at an example of this in code and one way we can actually use this. So I wrote up this little example here for a social media facade. And this class has access to several APIs that are pretty common in functionality. They're all social media. So you got a Twitter API, Facebook, Instagram. And so the facade has access to all three of these, which will allow it to call its functions whenever we need to do anything related to social media. So here in the constructor, we create these three objects that for the APIs. And in this example right here, I have a little method called connect to Twitter account. And it passes in a username and a password. And the facade class takes care of all the nitty-gritty details of, Twitter. You open your account with the username and password, and everything else basically that we need to take care of that stuff. It's able to, we write that here in the method, and if it's successful, we could return a Boolean or something saying that it was successfully done. And this allows the client to not have to worry about the nitty-gritty details of, oh, how do I do all this using the Twitter API? All we have to do is call the connect to Twitter account. So here in the example, we have the social media facade equals, we create the object, get the credentials from the user, and then we just call the method connect to the Twitter account, passing in our username and password. And so it really makes it easier for the client to implement those features of the APIs. So here's a couple uses for the pattern in our semester project. We can use it for our database, for our user accounts. So a database is it could be a pretty complex subsystem, but using a facade, we can just have easy to call methods of, send the username to the server, check the password, verify that it's correct, and just make sure that the database accepts the request and there's no errors in security. So that's one use. And then the other use is kind of going with that example that I showed earlier. So we could create a social media facade, and we can write methods for all the different things we'll be doing with social media, whether it's connecting to our Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, you name it. And we can share events fairly simply, and also post messages from the calendar, which will cover quite a bit of the features that we wrote about in the SRS. So the facade can be pretty useful. So upsides of this design pattern, it's useful for interfacing with legacy systems. So obviously, like a lot of legacy code, it's very verbose and like all the different functions you have to call, and it can get kind of complicated. But with a facade, you can place all that nitty-gritty detail in just one easy to call method. It can also be used to create controllers to connect presentation layers with application layers. So for people who are familiar with MVC model, it's really useful for guys who are doing the UI development. They don't have to worry about how this stuff is working. They can just call the facade functions to connect to the application and make everything run that way. So basically, it abstracts away complex functions so that the client can perform the tasks that they need to do without worrying. They don't need to understand how exactly the task is done. So it really gives you a black box that you can just call when you need it, and it'll get the job done. So some pretty good upsides for that. Now let's talk about some of the downsides. Probably the biggest downside that we should be concerned with is maintainability. And that's because you are connecting the subsystem methods to the facade layer. And this could get kind of complicated if anything in the subsystem, say you're using an API and the company that produced the API decides to change some of the methods, then you're going to have to go to your facade layer and change all of that code to update it with the current subsystem. And also you'll have to update your client methods that are calling all the different facade layer methods. So it could get kind of complicated in that aspect. Another issue is the facade design pattern. It's commonly misused or confused with other design patterns, often like the adapter. It's very different than the adapter in the sense that you're not really changing the format from one to another. Rather, you're making a whole new interface easier. But sometimes that gets confused with designers and they will implement it incorrectly, which can lead to miscommunication between developers. And the last downside is it can reduce coupling between classes and methods, which again, the biggest issue with that is later down the road, it's going to be harder to maintain, and there's going to be code that's going to need to be rewritten if anything does change down the road. So talking about recommendations and conclusion, I think the facade design pattern would be very useful for the student calendar project, especially for the social media APIs. So a lot of the APIs are doing similar functionality. You know, you're connecting to your account, you're sharing an event, or you're posting text. You know, all these are very similar concepts that we could share within a social media facade, which will allow us to make it easier for the client who's actually developing the code to make sure they do it correctly and not have to worry about the nitty-gritty details of the differences in the API functionality. If it's implemented correctly, this will also be really useful to reduce complexity for working with the user account database, as well as any other external systems that are pretty complex. So this could be just a way for us to deal with some of that complexity, make it easier for us to make a great product. So this is our works cited where we got all of our sources. And that concludes our presentation. So thank you so much for watching.